For over 12,000 cycles, war in the galaxy had been civilized. That was the word the consortium of aligned systems preferred. Civilized, predictable, orderly. Every conflict began the same way, a formal declaration transmitted across secure channels, followed by a mutually agreed engagement window. Coordinates were set. Fleet sizes were disclosed. Even weapon classes were limited to prevent unnecessary devastation. Entire species had risen and fallen within this structure, and through it all, the rules remained sacred. War, after all, was not meant to be chaos. It was meant to be controlled destruction, a way to settle disputes without endangering the balance of the galaxy. The Tyrellian High Command, one of the oldest military powers in known space, took particular pride in this system. Discipline, High Commander Vacor stated, his scaled form rigid as he addressed the War Council, is what separates warriors from beasts. The code ensures that even in conflict, we remain superior. A ripple of agreement passed through the chamber. No one questioned the code. No one ever had. Until now. A flicker of light filled the center of the chamber as a new transmission appeared. Unfamiliar encryption, erratic formatting, and no proper identification header. Vacor narrowed his eyes. Source. A technician hesitated. Unregistered. Commander. It doesn't match any known civilization protocols. Play it. The message activated, but instead of the usual structured declaration, the screen filled with fragmented visuals, a blue and green world, scattered data bursts, and a string of symbols that seemed almost hastily assembled. Then, finally, a translation resolved. This is the United Nations of Earth. We received your territorial claim. We do not recognize it. A murmur spread through the chamber. No formal tone. No honorifics. No acknowledgement of the code. Vacor's voice dropped. Where is their declaration format? Their fleet disclosure? The technician swallowed. There is none, Commander. Before anyone could respond, the message continued. If you intend hostile action, understand this. We will respond accordingly. Silence. Not according to the code. Not within agreed parameters. Just accordingly. A junior officer shifted uneasily. Perhaps they are unaware of proper procedure. A newly contacted species. Impossible, another interrupted. All spacefaring civilizations are briefed upon entry. Vacor's gaze hardened. Then they are choosing to ignore it. That had never happened before. Ignoring the code wasn't just reckless, it was unthinkable. Without it, war became unpredictable, uncontained, dangerous, primitive. Dispatch a formal correction, Vacor ordered. Educate them, provide the code, and demand compliance. Yes, Commander. The reply was sent within moments. A perfectly structured declaration, outlining engagement boundaries, weapon restrictions, and the designated battlefield coordinates. They waited, and waited. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Finally, a response arrived. Short, almost insultingly so. Yeah, we're not doing that. The chamber fell into stunned silence. Not doing, the technician whispered, as if the words themselves made no sense. Vacor felt something unfamiliar stir beneath his composure. Not anger. Not yet. Something closer to unease. Clarify their intent, he said slowly. The next message came almost immediately. War doesn't have rules. You'll learn. This time, no one spoke. Across 12,000 cycles, countless wars had been fought, yet never like this. Never without structure. Never without limits. Vacor straightened, forcing calm into his voice. Prepare the fleet. Standard formation. They will learn the importance of the code soon enough. But as the order echoed through the chamber, that unfamiliar feeling returned, because for the first time in recorded history, an enemy had refused to play by the rules. The battlefield had been chosen with precision. A barren system at the edge of Tyrellian-controlled space, 3 dead planets, a scattered asteroid belt, and a dim, aging star. It was perfect. Isolated. Contained. Predictable. Exactly as war was meant to be. High Commander Vacor stood upon the command platform of the flagship Sovereign Claw, his golden eyes fixed on the tactical display. Around him, officers moved with calm efficiency, their motions rehearsed through centuries of identical engagements. "Fleet formation complete," an officer reported. "All vessels aligned within agreed coordinates." Of course they were. The Tyrellians had followed the code to the letter. They always did. Rows of sleek warships hovered in perfect symmetry, each maintaining precise distance from the next. Weapon systems were powered, but limited as required. Shield output remained within regulation thresholds. Even targeting locks were restrained, awaiting the official start signal. Order. Discipline. Control. "This will be brief," one officer remarked quietly. "A demonstration of proper conduct." Vacor gave a slight nod. Once they witness structure, they will adapt. It had always been that way. Every species learned. Every species complied. A chime interrupted the calm. Contact detected. Vacor's gaze sharpened. Display. The projection shifted, and confusion rippled across the bridge. The human fleet was not in formation, not even close. Their ships were scattered, some drifting far beyond the designated zone, others weaving erratically through the asteroid belt. Several were already moving at high velocity, trajectories intersecting in ways that made no tactical sense. "Are they repositioning?" an officer asked. "No," another replied slowly. "They never formed up to begin with." Vacor felt that unease again. "Signal them," he ordered. "They are outside engagement parameters." A transmission was sent. No response. Instead, the human ships accelerated. "Commander," the tactical officer said, tension creeping into his voice, "multiple vessels are approaching from non-designated vectors." "That is not permitted," another snapped. "They must enter within there." The first explosion cut him off. It wasn't a grand opening volley. No warning barrage. No synchronized initiation. Just a sudden, violent detonation at the edge of the formation. An outer defense ship erupted into fire as something, small, fast, and entirely unexpected, slammed into its hull. "Impact confirmed," the tactical officer shouted. "Unidentified projectile. No energy signature. Kinetic," someone whispered in disbelief. Kinetic weapons were obsolete, unrefined, banned under the code for their unpredictability. Impossible. Another explosion. Then another. From behind. Multiple contacts emerging from the asteroid belt. Sensors screamed. "They're using debris as cover." Vacor's claws tightened. "They're not declaring attack phases. They're already engaging." "They never stopped moving," the navigation officer added, voice rising. "Commander, their flight paths. They're intersecting ours deliberately." Before Vacor could respond, the human fleet did something no civilized force had ever done. They broke the battlefield. Ships darted through the Tyrellian formation at close range, far closer than regulations allowed, forcing collision avoidance protocols to trigger. Lines shattered. Perfect symmetry collapsed into chaos. "They're inside our spacing limits," an officer cried. "We can't maintain formation." "Hold positions," Vekor commanded. But it was already too late. A human vessel surged past the Sovereign Claw, so close its hull scraped against the flagship's shields, sending ripples of energy across the display. "Direct proximity violation," alarms blared. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, several human ships veered away, only to release a swarm of smaller craft. "Boarding vessels?" someone guessed. "No." The tactical officer's voice dropped. "Those aren't troop carriers." The swarm accelerated, straight toward the Tyrellian ships. And then they exploded. Not with precision, not with restraint, but with raw, uncontrolled force. Silence fell over the bridge, broken only by the sound of failing systems and scattered reports. Vekor stared at the display, at the shattered formation, the burning ships, the complete absence of order. "They didn't signal," one officer whispered. "They didn't follow anything," another said. For the first time in his long command, Vekor understood the message humanity had sent. War, to them, was not a ritual. It was not controlled. It was not bound. It was chaos, and they had brought it with them. The aftermath of the first engagement did not resemble war. It resembled disaster. Fragments of Tyrellian vessels drifted through the dead system, their once perfect formation reduced to scattered wreckage. Emergency signals pulsed across every frequency, overlapping in chaotic desperation. Ships that had never known disorder now struggled simply to regroup. And through it all, the humans did not stop. "They're still moving," the tactical officer reported, voice strained. "No pause. No withdrawal window." Vekor stared at the display. "They should be resetting for the next phase." "There is no next phase," another officer said quietly. "Not for them." The realization settled heavily across the bridge. The code dictated clear stages: engage, disengage, reassess. Even in defeat, there was structure. Humanity had ignored that too. "New contacts," sensors blared. "Multiple signatures. No, wait. These aren't ships." The display shifted, zooming into a cluster of drifting debris from a destroyed cruiser. At first, it seemed harmless. Broken metal, lifeless fragments. Then it moved. "Commander," the sensor officer hesitated. "We're detecting active signals inside the wreckage." "Inside?" Vekor narrowed his eyes. Before an answer came, the debris field erupted. Hidden thrusters ignited from within shattered hull fragments, propelling them forward like shrapnel given purpose. Some pieces accelerated toward Tyrellian ships, others dispersed unpredictably, forcing defensive systems to track hundreds of erratic targets at once. "They're using their own wreckage," someone whispered in disbelief. "Impact in 3. The bridge shook as multiple fragments slammed into nearby vessels, their improvised propulsion turning debris into high-velocity weapons. No energy signatures, no targeting locks. The tactical officer struggled to keep up. "We can't predict their vectors." Vekor's voice hardened. "Adapt. Expand targeting parameters." "We can't, Commander," came the reply. "There are too many. This violates every engagement model." Another alarm cut through the chaos. "Signal breach. Unknown code entering our systems." The main display flickered, then distorted, then changed entirely. Instead of tactical data, the screen filled with something else. Sound. Human sound. Loud. Chaotic. Rhythmic. "What is that?" an officer snapped. "Audio transmission forced into our systems," the technician replied, horrified. "They're overriding our channels." The noise intensified, pounding beats, distorted voices, something almost aggressive in tone. "Shut it down," Vekor ordered. "We're trying." But even as they struggled, more systems began to glitch. Targeting reticles flickered. Communication lines overlapped. Sensor feeds lagged by critical seconds. "They're not just attacking physically," the tactical officer realized. "They're disrupting everything." Another explosion rocked the fleet. Human vessels approaching again, high velocity. This time, they didn't weave or scatter. They came straight through. Direct. Reckless. A Tyrellian cruiser fired within regulated limits. Controlled bursts, precise timing. The human ship didn't evade. It pushed forward. "Commander, it's not slowing down." "Evasive maneuvers," someone shouted. Too late. The human vessel collided with the cruiser. Not a glancing blow. A full impact. The explosion that followed was blinding, far beyond what standard engagement protocols allowed. Silence filled the bridge. "They rammed us," an officer said faintly. Ramming. A tactic so crude, so wasteful, it had been abandoned before the code was even written. And yet it worked. Vekor felt it now, fully and unmistakably. Not unease. Not confusion. Fear. "Commander," the navigation officer whispered, "they're targeting our retreat vectors." The display confirmed it. Human ships were already moving to intercept escape paths, cutting off routes before the Tyrellians had even formally disengaged. "They're predicting us," Vekor murmured. "No," the tactical officer corrected. "They're not predicting, they're forcing us." Every movement the Tyrellians made was being shaped, redirected, trapped, not by superior firepower, but by relentless unpredictability. Vekor straightened slowly, his voice quieter now. "They are not fighting to win within the system." The officers looked at him. "They are fighting to break it." Another wave of human signals surged across their systems, erratic, unstructured, impossible to categorize. And for the first time in 12,000 cycles, the Tyrellian High Command had no rule to respond with. There was no formation anymore. What remained of the Tyrellian fleet drifted in fractured clusters, isolated ships, damaged cruisers, and scattered command vessels struggling to re-establish even the illusion of order. The battlefield, once defined by precise boundaries and clean geometry, had become something unrecognizable. Chaotic. Fluid. Alive. High Commander Vekor stood in silence as reports flooded in faster than they could be processed. "Sector 3 has collapsed. No response from 2 capital ships. Navigation grids are failing. We can't calculate safe vectors. Multiple human signatures inside minimum engagement distance. Shields at 40% and dropping." Each voice layered over the next, breaking the disciplined calm that had defined Tyrellian command for millennia. "Enough." Vekor's voice cut through the noise, not loud but absolute. The bridge fell still. For a moment he said nothing. His gaze remained fixed on the tactical display, watching the scattered remains of what had once been a perfect fleet. "This cannot continue," he said finally. An officer straightened. "Commander, we can attempt to re-establish code compliance. Issue a ceasefire demand. Force a reset." Another nodded quickly. "Yes, yes, if we invoke Article 7, they are required to disengage. All signatories must." "They are not signatories," Vekor interrupted. "Silence." It was such a simple truth. And yet it changed everything. They never accepted the code, he continued. We assumed they would. We assumed all would. A slow, uncomfortable realization spread across the bridge. The code had never been universal. It had only ever been agreed upon. Then we enforce it, a weapons officer said, desperation creeping into his voice. We escalate within regulation, maximum authorized output. Show them the consequences of. A violent tremor shook the flagship. Direct hit, came the shout. Port shields compromised. Vacor didn't flinch. Status of the attacker? Gone, Commander. They struck and withdrew. No pattern, no formation. Of course they had. They always did. Commander. The tactical officer hesitated. We're losing control of the battlefield. No, Vacor said quietly. He stepped forward, claws resting against the edge of the command console. We already lost it. The words settled heavily. For the first time, no one argued. Another alarm flared. Multiple inbound objects, high mass, low velocity, sensors reported. Origin, unknown. The display shifted. At first, the objects seemed insignificant, dark shapes drifting at the edge of detection. Then the scans clarified. Asteroids. Dozens of them. Natural debris, an officer asked. No, the sensor technician whispered. They've been redirected. Engines, crude, but effective. The asteroids accelerated. Not quickly, but steadily. Projected impact in 6 minutes, the tactical officer said. Collision spread across the fleet. Intercept them, someone snapped. We can't target them all. There are too many. And if even a few make contact, the officer trailed off. They all understood. This wasn't precision warfare. This was annihilation through inevitability. Vacor exhaled slowly. They're forcing us to move. Yes, Commander. And when we move. The navigation officer answered, voice tight. We break further. Lose cohesion completely. Exactly as the humans intended. Every option led to collapse. Fight, and be overwhelmed. Hold position, and be crushed. Retreat, and be hunted. There was no correct move. No rule to follow. No structure to rely on. For 12,000 cycles, the code had provided answers to every scenario. Now, it provided none. Commander, a junior officer spoke, barely above a whisper. What are your orders? Vacor closed his eyes for a brief moment. When he opened them, something had changed. Not fear, not uncertainty. Acceptance. Abandon the code. The words struck harder than any weapon. See, Commander, the officer stammered. All ships, Vacor continued, his voice steady, disengage from formal protocols. Prioritize survival. Adapt as necessary. Silence filled the bridge. Then, slowly, understanding dawned. You're telling us to. Yes. For the first time in recorded history, a Tyrellian commander gave an order that had never existed before. Fight like them. Outside, the asteroids closed in, and across the broken battlefield, humanity waited. Not in formation, not with order, but with the quiet certainty that the galaxy's oldest rules had just been shattered. The war did not end with a final battle. There was no decisive formation, no last, honorable clash between fleets aligned in symmetry. There was only silence. Weeks after the breaking point, The battlefield had gone still. The dead system, once filled with fire and motion, now held only drifting wreckage and fading signals. What remained of the Tyrellian fleet had withdrawn, scattered, damaged, but alive. And the humans had simply stopped. No pursuit. No final strike. No demand for surrender. They vanished as abruptly as they had appeared. The Tyrellian High Council chamber was quieter than it had ever been. No debates. No confident declarations. Only the weight of something none of them had ever faced before. Defeat. Without understanding. High Commander Vekor stood before the council, his posture unchanged, but something behind his eyes was different. "You are certain?" one councillor asked, voice low. "They have disengaged completely?" "Yes," Vekor replied. "All human forces have exited contested space." "And they made no demands?" "None." A murmur spread through the chamber, uneasy, unsettled. "That is not logical," another councillor said. "Victory requires terms, territory, concessions." Vekor shook his head slightly. "That is how we define victory." Silence followed. "Then why fight at all?" a third councillor pressed. "What purpose does war serve without structure?" Vekor paused. It was the question that had lingered since the first message, since the first chaotic strike, since the moment everything they believed about war had begun to unravel. "They were not fighting for victory as we understand it," he said slowly. The council watched him. "They were fighting to ensure that we could not win." The words settled like gravity. Days later, a final transmission arrived. Unlike the first, it was clear, direct, intentionally structured, but still lacking the formal tone of the code. The chamber gathered as it played. To the Tyrellian High Command. No honorifics. No deference. But no hostility, either. You expected war to follow rules. That's your mistake. Several councillors shifted uncomfortably. Vekor remained still. Rules work when both sides agree to them, when survival isn't on the line. The message paused briefly, as if allowing the words to settle. We don't fight wars to keep things orderly. We fight to end them. A flicker of unease passed through the chamber. If you threaten us again, understand this. We won't follow your system. We'll break it. Every time. Silence. Then, finally, learn from this. The transmission ended. No one spoke for a long time. The Tyrellians had faced countless enemies across 12,000 cycles. They had won, lost, negotiated, adapted, but always within the safety of the code. This was different. This was something the code had never prepared them for. "High Commander," one councillor began carefully, "what do we do now?" Vekor looked out across the chamber, across the species that had believed themselves the masters of controlled war, and he gave the only answer that remained. "We change." The code of war was not abolished, but it was no longer absolute. New clauses were written, contingencies for non-compliant species, adaptive protocols, emergency freedoms once thought unnecessary, even dangerous. Entire doctrines were rewritten, not to abandon order, but to survive without it. And far beyond Tyrellian space, the message spread, from one civilization to another. A warning, a lesson, a quiet understanding carried across the stars, that somewhere in the galaxy existed a species that did not fear chaos, that did not rely on rules, that would rewrite the nature of war itself if forced to fight. From that day forward, No one assumed war had rules anymore, because humanity had proven something the galaxy would never forget. Rules only exist until someone decides they don't.